Again, my name is Tracia Banuelos, and I'm so appreciative to be thankful. Thank you for the chaplain's office for having me here. I love coming out and talking to folks about really interesting issues within the sexual violence movement that really do affect us all. I have a lot in here. I'm going to do my best to be paced and to make sure that I quit speaking on time because I respect folks' time and you have classes and other things. But thank you all for coming today. I'm very passionate about this issue. We'll go ahead and get started. So the title is Carcerality is Not Justice. And I want to define carcerality really quickly. The carcerality really encompasses the process of policing, of creating laws that allow humans to be disposable, the maintenance of slavery through the loopholes of the 13th Amendment. And so it's really this entire system of what do you do with people who commit harm? And currently in the United States, that involves prisons, jails, immigrant detention centers, and other spaces like that. So I want to do a very quick disclaimer. So let me just hop out of the way. That the presentation, one, is not intended to do more work for survivors. So quite often survivors of sexual violence are at the forefront of these movements, as they should be. But I don't want it to seem that survivors are the ones who have to do the educating and the work, because they should be focusing on healing first. And that should be the responsibility of other folks that care about these issues to buy into why it's so important. The second part is that this is part of a larger movement of the anti-sexual violence movement. And I want to put a piece in there because quite often, whenever we talk about survivorhood, especially in the media, there's a lot of rhetoric around those who perpetrate violence and not enough about the folks who are survivors of this violence. The reason I've chosen this topic is because in my work I found that we have to end violence by starting with those who perpetrate the violence. So this work is a piece of the movement, and I don't believe the work that should center perpetrators, but they are an important part of actually if we want to realistically end violence. And then finally, that this doesn't seek to inform survivors on how to heal. This is just a larger conversation about what structures do we have in place for rehabilitation of those who do perpetrate violence. So I want to just put that piece in there to just make sure that survivors are always central to the work, but we're having this conversation about perpetrators because they're the ones who actually enact the violence, and it's up to each one of us to not perpetrate said violence. So just a little bit about me. My name is Tracia Banuelos. I'm born and raised in the Midwest in Kansas, best barbecue in the world. I use she, her pronouns. And then I'm also a survivor myself. And I wanted to mention that I'm a survivor who has personally chosen not to participate in the criminal justice system. Through the violences that I have endured, I've been given opportunities to make criminal reports. At some points before I had the knowledge, it was a large process I just did not want to be involved in. And then as I got older and there's an opportunity again, I didn't feel comfortable participating in that system. So that's kind of where this topic comes about. But again, this is my viewpoint and my survivor journey. And I don't want anyone who's a survivor or anyone who takes a lesson to tell other survivors that they shouldn't participate because it's their choice and it's all that we have at the current moment. So why this topic? Violence is cyclical. And all forms of oppression are interconnected. Whether or not they look like it, they are. They have the same power structures and the same sources, and quite often the same folks who benefit from those oppressions. If we are honest about wanting a better society, then we have to ask the hard questions on how to create that society. And there's not a lot of space to realistically do so. But I think asking the hard questions is the first place to start if we want realistic solutions. And then the second piece is that ignoring the harm that's exposed to others who commit harms just maintains the violence. And that finally, out of sight, out of mind, is again how violence thrives. There's a quote in sexual violence work that violence thrives in silence. And quite often the sexual violence that prisoners are exposed to and inmates are exposed to is a product and is viewed as a punishment as well. And I don't believe that exposing someone to harm will actually bring me any justice as a survivor myself. So that's the lens that I'm approaching this work at. Probably should take this piece. So there was a couple quotes. They're all from activist Angela Davis and popular prison abolitionists. So I wanted to put this quote in here because this is kind of the framework that I use for how I do the work that I do. And the quote says, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. There are a lot of folks who say that we can't end racism, or that we can't end capitalism, that we can't end colonialism. I call bullshit. I think that we can. I think that we can create systems. Now, will it be done overnight? No. But it doesn't mean that we can't strategize on what that looks like. Capitalism is not the only source for economies. Racism, all of these issues, again, these issues at one point did not exist, and they were created. So we can undo those harms and also create other systems, though not through those lenses. So this, and actually I should have done a better job. I meant to say that I do my utmost to not put specifics in here to trigger folks, but the quote that's on the next slide has a potential for triggering. It's a quote from Angela Davis in her book, Abolition Democracy. So I wanted to preface that it does get a little specific for anyone as a heads up. But Angela Davis writes about one of these experiences and says, if uniforms are replaced with civilian clothes, the guards and the prisoners, then the act of strip searching would look exactly like the sexual violence that is experienced by the prisoner who was ordered to remove her clothing, stoop and spread her buttocks, and the continuum of sexual violence is even more obvious. Quite often we think that the answer to what do we do with folks who perpetrate harm is to put them in prison. And then we somehow have believed that that is justice. And so what I'm asking folks to do is think a little deeper on, is does putting someone in a system where they're going to be exposed to further harm actually bring justice to the person who was originally harmed? Does that system actually rehabilitate someone to learn how to no longer perpetrate violence? Does it actually unpack why they committed the violence in the first place? Or is it a system where you did this one thing and now you're exposed to it again over and over, and somehow that's justice? Anyone who consumes a lot of American popular media, there's a lot of jokes about sexual violence that comes into prisons. Or when someone does something outside of prison, they'll get their justice when they go to prison. And I want us to think, is that actually justice? Carcerality is not working. When we look at if carcerality was actually ending violence, we would see a reduction in instances of violence, and we don't. The prison criminal justice system really was never fair to begin with, and disparities have only gotten larger. Prison actually provides opportunities for perpetrators to continue the harm that they cause instead of actually stopping it and learning how to become different people. And in a space where quality trauma-informed mental health services are unavailable in prisons, perpetration is established as a way of getting and maintaining power. So really all that we have done when we put someone who commits harm into the system is give them a new batch of people to expose harm to, and a new batch of people to maintain power over. And so it's because of this, if we get to the specifics of what's actually happening, we learn that justice is not taking place, education is not taking place, counseling isn't taking place. It's just harm after harm after harm. So I wanted to put in this graphic from the Prison Policy Initiative that one talks about who even is in prisons. And so this is from data they gathered from 2019, where currently, if we consider all prisons, 63, actually that's not, I'm thinking of a different graphic. So if we look at state prisons, we have over 1 million people in state prisons, 600,000 in local jails, 221 in federal prisons. We have also incarcerated youth, but I think the more powerful graphic is here, that 76% of folks in prisons are not convicted of any crime. And there's, even if we go into a lot deeper of how many folks are in prisons for non-violent crime. And if we incorporate as well spaces that prisons use to rent to other folks, it's actually closer to 63% are not convicted. There's a larger conversation around who those people are. Quite often folks awaiting trial, folks who are stopped and frisked, folks who are mistaken. It's a large system that we don't have a lot of time to talk about today, but if you're interested, I would implore you to think about who is actually in prison, and are else folks actually people who are committing crimes, or they fit the profile of someone who is committing a crime. But I wanted to put this in here because, again, if we think about who's in prison, our brain may say bad people or people who have done wrong things. And there's data shows us that it's actually not those people. Another quote from Angela Davis, that prison relieves us from the responsibility of seriously engaging with the problems of society, especially those produced by racism and increasingly global capitalism. In some of the slides, we can talk, if anyone has questions, we can go into deeper. But again, we have in the United States, people of color, namely Black Americans, are overrepresented in police. The amount of folks who are undocumented are overrepresented. So again, there's a disparity between who is committing crimes and who is getting accused of committing crimes and then thrown into prison labor. So I wanted to go over a couple of terms that have a little bit of a shared vocabulary with you all. The first one is I want you all to think about what is justice. Whether it's from your own definition, if it's from a spiritual source, if it's from a legal source, what is your understanding of justice? I just want you to hold and to think about it for a moment. And so then I have a question of more so what should justice look like? Because again, there's this kind of esoteric viewpoint of what justice is, and it's defined by our court system, it's defined by our legal system, and it's defined by inherently racist institutions, inherently classist institutions, and institutions that have profited from disposing certain people. So I want us to think about what would justice look like in a perfect world, and I had a couple ideas of what I thought. I thought, number one, real justice is an action that centers the needs of the person that's harmed. That person is consistently left out of the conversation. They may, if you think about a court trial, someone who maybe is harmed by another person may have a chance to provide testimony, but there's not an opportunity to say, what do I actually need? What can I get? What can we repair? Those questions are conveniently left out of the conversation. The next thing I assert is that real justice repairs what was lost, stolen, or harmed in the first place. So again, real justice goes back to what was actually happened and how do I undo the harm to attempt to put the person, the innocent person, back into a space that they were before the harm occurred. So how do you actually undo that harm? Third, it creates an opportunity for community and systemic conversation that would lead to reform to prevent that harm from happening again. So we would think that a justice system would say, this is what a problem is. This is how we've learned to understand the problem. Now we're now educating other folks in the community on what this problem is, how to prevent it, what steps led up to it, and we're having community buy-in to not perpetuate the harm that's here. And then finally, it's trauma informed. I talk a little bit later about a trauma economy, but trauma is central to why folks commit crimes. It's not an excuse, it's a reason. Nothing excuses harm, but we can look at reasons on what drove people to certain things. And if we actually think about rehabilitation, if we think about the reasons that cause folks to commit violence, we want to help them unpack and to readjust and to learn and move away from those different coping strategies they had from the trauma they received. So real justice recognizes that we are multi-system people and that trauma occurs, and we need to understand how to work with trauma. I want you all to think about really quickly what disposability is, what it means, what context we hear of it quite often. I ask this piece quite often because when we think about those who are in prisons, what prisons do, we're honestly just disposing of folks who commit harm and pushing them out of sight, out of mind. And a lot of language around prison reform and those who are currently incarcerated is we are not disposable. But that's not how our current systems have treated these individuals. So I created a definition around what disposability would mean in a justice context or in a social context. And I view it as a practice that anyone can embody that creates a hierarchy of who is human or non-human, in which non-humans are used for labor profit system that disregards their needs and bodies once it gets what it wants. So there's a lot of ways to think about that. I think about in hookup culture, how do folks treat another person like they're disposable? They get what they want and they move on. They do not care about that person's needs. We think about when someone may have made you feel used or disposable. You get what you want and then you move on. And so prisons have really been this opportunity to show us who is disposable in society. And if we look at the more research into the prison industrial complex, which in short is just a system of how companies are benefiting from prisoners, making clothes, making products for very, very cheap labor, and then increasing their profits. Anyone who likes Victoria's Secret, your underwear come from prison labor. There's a long list of companies that invest in prison labor because it's a cheap way to get their product. So again, this is a smaller part of a much larger system that I wish it could be in its entire degree, and we only have like 30 minutes. But it's important because, again, there's this belief of who is human and who is non-human, and what does a human need? If someone commits harm, is that person still a human? And so we'll kind of get to that in a little bit later. But prison fuels disposability. It puts those labeled with doing harm out of sight, out of mind. And there are no federal standards to making sure that rehabilitation, what we're told prison does, it tells you what you did wrong, it gives you a chance to learn how to not do wrong again, and we bring you back into society. There's no federal standards to ensure that that actually is a goal, and that it's accessible, that it is created for people who may not know how to read, for folks with language barriers, that it's trauma-informed. And that finally, prison maintains labor. Prison labor is an essential part of the American economy. So why would we ever want to get rid of an institution that provides cheap clothes, cheap labor? We'd have to fully divest from that as a source of income to refocus on the humanity of the people that are there. So I thought it'd be interesting to put in 2 mission statements. The first one is the Department of Justice. Their mission statement is to enforce the law and defend the interests of the United States according to the law, to ensure public safety against threats, foreign and domestic, to provide federal leadership in preventing and controlling crime, to seek just punishment for those guilty of unlawful behavior, and to ensure fair and impartial administration of justice for all Americans. In no way is rehabilitation even a goal in their mission statement. If you go through the Department of Justice website, I challenge you to look for where rehabilitation could even be mentioned. What it looks like, what standards there are, who's doing it, are there licensed social workers, are there therapists, are there counselors, who is doing this? And is this actually a goal of the system? The second statement is the Federal Bureau of Prisons. This is just a piece from their About Us section. The website doesn't have a whole lot of information, but their About Us section. Our agency was established in 1930 to provide more progressive and humane care for federal inmates, to professionalize the prison service, and to ensure consistent and centralized administration of federal prisons. Yet again, no opportunity to talk about rehabilitation, about safer societies, about actually undoing harm where it starts and getting to the root causes. So and it's obvious that that's not a goal of prisons, but when we talk about prisons in the rhetoric, we hear it's rehabilitation, it's to learn, but that's not anywhere in the mission from these organizations from themselves. Oh, it's from there twice. So I wanted to put a couple of the really tough questions that I have and that folks have around these issues. Again, we don't ask the hard questions, and what are we even doing? Question number 1. Can a system designed to maintain slavery be reappropriated for good? So we think about if anyone has seen 13th, the documentary on Netflix, we're doing research, we learn that prisons are allowed to exist from a piece of the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, except for the case of committing harm and someone to repair the harm that they have done. So prisons are legally justified as slavery. So can that system actually be used to repair harm? How do we end sexual violence? There, again, a common question is prisons have been talked about being helpful because it takes the people who commit crimes and puts them away. But that's not really ending the crime. It just shifts it to a different group of people who are taught it's not important. Who loses the right to be a human? Who decides and who benefits from that discussion? And then I have a couple of assertions of my own that I think could be starting points for answers to these questions. Number one, systems are not dysfunctional, nor are they broken. They're designed for very specific outcomes and benefits. And this was something that when I learned, as information comes from the Kansas Leadership Center, KLC, a leader in the nation of all things leadership. And I have a lot of feelings about that. But aside from that point, we think about when we say a dysfunctional system, a broken system, we may think of foster care, adoption systems, welfare systems, systems that we're told have good intentions, but somehow don't work. And I challenge you all to think about what policies or procedures or structures are within that system are actually designed to solve the problem. Because if they were designed to solve the problem, they would work. So we can say a system is dysfunctional or broken, but if we don't investigate the actual legs, like if we have a table that's wobbly, if we don't go to the little, what is that thing on a table that wobbles? The leg, yes. If we don't look at the legs, if we don't see what bolts are missing, if we don't see what, we can just say the table's broken, and then yet have done nothing to actually fix the table for folks who want to come and sit there. So again, I challenge folks, when we look at, again, when there are no federal standards for humane care, for rehabilitation, will we say that the PRISM system is actually broken, or that it wants to produce a certain outcome? Again, as I mentioned earlier, sexual violence starts and ends with perpetration and those who maintain the violence. There's a lot of work and a lot of programs that focus on helping a perpetrator understand why they did something and unpacking that. That's currently missing from our prison system. And the next piece, that exposing perpetrators to harm does not bring me justice. When there was a situation where I could have pressed charges to someone, I had to think long and hard about if I would actually feel better, more like myself, if I would feel whole, if I would feel better, if the person that had did what they did to me would just be exposed to that harm. And I think about a lot of these situations of the context of the situation that I was in. In the situation I was in, there was someone who was not heterosexual, and the police officer that was talking to me and attempting to give me support, whatever that his definition of the word was, I could tell that that person really had an investment in making sure that this queer human was put away. And at that moment, again, what the cop wanted and what I needed were two different things. And for myself, putting that person, exposing them to harm was not going to actually change anything. And when you think about if we just take the scale larger, again, there's no rehabilitation that's done in these settings. And all we're done, again, is giving perpetrators another pool of people to harm. I also assert that the United States government, based on a history of investment in human rights violations and exploitation, cannot be trusted to make these decisions. Time and time again, we have learned from the United States government that they are not invested in morality, or we would not be on the land that we're on right now. That is not United States land. If the United States cared about maintaining morality, a lot of things would be different. And many of us might not even be in this country, in this space, because we're on indigenous land. So really, can we trust an institution that made slavery legal in certain cases to also be the institution that decides who's human and who's not human? Can we trust a system that is invested in racism and classism to tell us who deserves or what justice looks like when they're coming from a lens that oppression is okay if you benefit from it, if you make money from it? And I personally argue no. So I put in here a couple practices that challenge carceral justice and the idea that carcerality is actual justice. The first one being the pillars of prison abolition. So there are a lot of really incredible activists at the forefront of the prison abolition movement, which seeks to rid prisons. It doesn't say that accountability should not be there, but saying that prisons are not a space that enforce accountability. Two terms that I wanted everyone to be exposed to are restorative justice and transformative justice. Very powerful practices. Restorative justice is a practice that emphasizes accountability, making amends, and if someone's interested, facilitated meetings between victims, offenders, and other folks. So in a restorative justice practice, the person who commits harm is not pushed away, but actually there is facilitated work between the person who's committed harm and the person who's harmed. Is how do I repair what's been done? How am I accountable to my actions? How am I not shifting the conversation to focus on me, to focus on your needs? But at this point, I'm centering yourself and I'm adjusting my behavior to give you what you have lost, an actual repair. And the next one is a transformative justice, which we'll define a little bit more on the next slide. It's a liberatory approach that seeks safety and accountability without relying on alienation, punishment, or the state, or systemic violence, including incarceration and policing. Transformative justice is also called community engagement, which is a practice of, again, how do we involve the community in understanding what was wrong here? How do we get the community to have opportunity to heal together? Because in an ideal world, when one person's harming the community, the entire community is feeling for that person. And again, if we think about perpetration, folks who perpetrate sexual violence do it multiple times. So most likely just because one person has come forward doesn't mean that that's the only person that was harmed by that person. So community engagement or transformative justice approach allows the community to say, what do we need? How do we be accountable to how this person's behaviors? How have we contributed? How have we not supported someone? How have we also allowed a system for violence to take place and we turned a blind eye to it? There's a couple of really powerful core beliefs of transformative justice. The first one is that individual justice and collective liberation are equally important, mutually supportive, and fundamentally intertwined. So you can't receive individual justice without collective liberation. They're two pieces of the same chair, maybe. The next one is that the conditions that allow violence to occur must be transformed in order to achieve justice for individuals. So again, the situations, the values, the beliefs that cause someone to commit harm have to be transformed to not allow that harm to be committed again. So that forces us to think about, again, root causes of issues, looking at trauma, looking at poverty, looking at things that cause, or reasons, not excuses, reasons that cause folks to commit harm. How do we get rid of those reasons, undo the harm of them, and replace them with actual practices that support individuals? And then finally, state and systemic responses to violence, including the criminal legal system, child welfare agencies, not only fail to advance individual and collective justice, but also condone and perpetrate cycles of violence. We see this quite often, again, if we think about how these agencies run, when they are not built with structure. You can throw money at a problem, but throwing money at a problem doesn't fix it if you don't know how to use that money, if you don't use the resources to support the folks most affected. It takes real work, it takes passion, it takes love and care. We think about the foster system. How many folks are driven to homelessness? How many folks commit crimes to be put into prisons because it is their only chance of having a meal or having a place to stay? So again, what are the conditions that cause harm to thrive, and how do we undo those conditions as a community? Because if there's 5 of us in the community and 4 of us are bought in and the one person isn't, that now is a threat to the safety of the community. So how do we work with that person, see why they're not buying in, and actually transform? And again, it's not easy, but just because it's not easy doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. And then I have a couple of suggested next steps from my own personal research and belief about the issue. I think number 1 is key, is divestment in a trauma economy. We live in an economy where trauma is profitable and it's exploitable, rather than focusing on healing and support for all. If we really understand situations that cause someone that lead to trauma, where someone is traumatized or they are altered or harmed, we need to focus and make sure that we're not profiting from that trauma, that we're not exploiting that trauma, that we're trying to center the person and hopefully create a world where trauma doesn't exist, or that we're not exposing folks to trauma. The second would be an investment in practices that center nurturing, exploration of attachment styles, and logic patterns. I recently read a book that really left an impact on me called Turn the World Inside Out. And it's a book that evolved from an essay called Nurturance Culture is the Answer to Rape Culture. And folks have done a lot of research about, again, what actually causes someone to perpetrate violence. And they've taken some of this research back to attachment theory, which is basically, in short, depending on how your own parents or guardians responded to you as a child when you cried, when you were hungry, when you had needs, really can inform the way that you grow up and can either communicate those needs, understand others' needs, and get your needs. So if we look at the research, we go back again to how are people formed? How do we create practices that solve the root cause of the problem? And attachment theory and these different psychological exposures to parenting are ways that we can go to the root cause and teach folks how to fulfill their needs in healthy ways that don't harm someone else in the process. And then finally, a shift towards all communities and incorporating wholeness practices through a social justice lens. If we don't look at the way that racism is central to prison labor, if we don't look at the way that classism is central, or nationalism, by the fact that you can jail someone who is undocumented, if we don't look at all these different pieces, we're really doing a disservice to the folks that are actually in the spaces. So I'm asserting that we should look at people as whole beings, look at the whole issue of a person, and respond to all of those needs. And if we move towards creating a culture where someone's entire wholeness is respected, we will see better things. So I want you all to think about the power of just your deeds. I went to an institution where I didn't have an administrative dean. I had a faculty advisor that most folks saw on the day that they were trying to graduate and they were filling out their degree audit. You think about the dean structure at Colgate. You have this support person who is there to validate that other things happen in your life that affect your academics. That type of practice is a wholeness practice because it's saying you are a person. You're not, even though you're here as a college student to learn and to get a degree, that's not the only piece of you. So how do we incorporate practices for justice to look at all pieces of a person instead of ones of just a piece that we can criminalize and benefit from that labor? So these are my personal assertions on thinking about the next steps from divesting from this trauma economy. But because I wanted to be on time and there are questions, that's what I got for you all. There's a lot. I'm here, but are there any questions about it, about the work, research? I know it's a very controversial topic. There's a lot of pieces there, but I'm love to talk to folks about it if they're interested. Thank you so much.